BASIC helped to connect the time-sharing computer world. However, all the various computer systems were decentralized. Even as programs crossed between them, the transfer was entirely uncoordinated. Amateur programmers had no place to feed into, nor draw from. By the 1970s, these barriers were eroding. Networks became networked themselves through programs like the ARPANET. Software was finding its way outside of its home time-sharing system. Most importantly of all, publications aimed at tech enthusiast computer users began to be sold commercially, like the books by the People's Computer Company founders. Shards of this computer culture found many advocates, but none created as firm of a foundation for the future of computers as one David H. Ahl. Born in the tradition of many tech enthusiasts, David Ahl came to his passion for electronics through radio. As a student in New York, he was one of the lucky few who wound up playing the computer tennis game at Brookhaven Laboratories in the late 1950s. Ahl set out to be an educator and managed to get a job with the Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, as a marketer in charge of their outreach to schools, a broader range of which were able to afford a computer in the late 1960s. Part of his marketing plan was to create a newsletter for educational computer users, called Education or EDU, which provided tips to educators on integrating computers into the classroom. As part of his mission to fill up the rather small magazine, Ahl wanted to include program listings as part of education's content. DEC had a competing language to BASIC, called Focal, which many of the programs on DEC computers were written in, but Ahl ported many of these to the more universal BASIC. As part of his job, Ahl was well aware of the many time-sharing networks, and whenever he found a potential good program, he would save it for a section of the newsletter. These type-ins became quite popular as he amassed a vast collection of displays and games, well in excess of what he could print. This prompted him to think about packaging these various small listings into a single volume to sell to the public. Other books with type-in listings had been published, but with a singular focus on entertainment programs and the backing of a company like DEC, Ahl believed there was an opportunity to meet an unfulfilled need in the market. Initially, his bosses didn't see any benefits to this endeavor. Users, from their view, were those tied into the existing ecosystems of DEC computers. BASIC didn't help bring people into that ecosystem. Nevertheless, Ahl was persistent, and they agreed to put together a limited print run of the book to see if it had the market potential he saw. With this approval in hand, he scoured the vaguely connected computer environments to collect over 100 programs from wherever he could find them. Sometimes this included contacting individual authors, soliciting programs as part of EDU, or making his own variations on programs to help pad out the book. There weren't really 100 programs as such, but it was a nexus of the time-sharing computing world, which was eventually published as 101 Basic Computer Games in July 1973. Many of the games Ahl collected in this book already had a long legacy. Descendants of the Sumerian game, the Lunar Landing Program, Star Trek, Cartesian map games, and many more. Basically, it was a commercialization of what had been freely available on time-sharing networks. Ahl was diligent in accrediting where he could, even if finding the true original author was often difficult. What he provided simply would not have reached the audience it did without him. Users were eager to have programs, rarely over a single page, to type into their computers. Before long, the book was selling massive numbers. It entered 3 total printings, selling tens of thousands of copies, a number which, according to all, exceeded the number of available computers at the time. It seemed like an unqualified success. However, DEC did not exactly see it that way. The book didn't increase subscribers to the newsletter, and they still didn't believe in a user-driven approach to their hardware. Software was simply not a priority. Fed up with this, all left in 1974, and thereafter started up a new magazine, Creative Computing. Not merely a newsletter like the PCC, this was a full-fledged publication focusing around the expanding field of computer use. It dropped at exactly the right time to catch a new wave of people coming into computing who wanted something more fun and recreational rather than functional. Serendipity or forward thinking, David All became the messenger that BASIC needed. 101 BASIC computer games remained the benchmark for any computer system with open access and became the most widely available way people shared game experiences on computers. In this book are the roots of a new generation of hackers, sprung forth from the MIT tradition back in the days of Space War. The mass market, though, was still in coin-op, with Pong-alikes lighting up bars, taverns, and even a few arcades across the US. It was up to Atari to respond to the ongoing threat. The first video game craze was on, and they felt the pressure to move the technology forward before anyone else had a chance to catch up. Nolan Bushnell was not happy about the Pong clones. After their launch in November 1972, isolated to the area of Northern California, companies from both inside and outside the coin-op industry hopped on the idea. Such a thing was far from uncommon, even in recent history, but it dogged Atari nonetheless. Bushnell called these competitors jackals for feasting on the flesh of Atari's bones. However, the original game was still selling rather well. Atari was able to occupy a new manufacturing plant on the back of its success, from which they hired anybody they could find to man the lines. It became a booming, wild, unstructured operation that struggled to keep pace with the new flood of interest coming in. They recognized that the Pong market couldn't last, and it was up to them to establish video games as a truly new category for the coin-op industry. The only company who went to Atari to license Pong was Bally, the same company who had contracted Atari for their first game. That contract had never been properly fulfilled after Pong was turned down, so Bushnell decided to tie up several loose ends with Atari's next new game. During the creation of Computer Space, Bushnell had come up with a simpler idea for a game he called Asteroid. In it, players piloted their rocket to avoid an asteroid field to make it to the other side. Bushnell turned this over to Pong creator Al Alcorn, who designed a 2-player racing game about deftly dodging space debris. When the player reached the other side, they'd appear back at the bottom, score a point, and repeat until the time limit was up. The production model of the game used some of the same tricks as in Computer Space, like the ship half outlined in diodes, to support its more complex mechanisms compared to Pong. Atari presented this game to Bally in February 1973 under the designation VP2 for release under their amusement subsidiary Midway after their licensed Pong clone, Winner. But Atari decided to jump the gun on Midway's release and announced the availability of the game from them as Space Race before Midway was ready to ship. Not at all happy about this, the companies came to an arrangement. Asteroid would still fulfill the contract, but Atari would get no royalty payments from the game. With that, Atari was now free of any obligation to their competitors. Could that have been the idea? Space Race didn't do particularly well compared to Pong or Pong Doubles. More than its gameplay, the game introduced two very important things. Firstly, it was the premier video game to use joysticks as controllers. Joysticks had existed in various forms on electromechanical games, but this innovation helped to bring a slimmer form factor into the digital realm. The second innovation was in Space Race's advertising. In addition to using the word video game unabashedly for the first time, it also featured a new Atari logo. Atari previously used a melded logo to represent their syzygy engineering roots, a name they still often went by. This new design was created by independent graphic designer George Opperman. Though it has many supposed origins, such as representing the two paddles and the lines of Pong, it was eventually trademarked as the Fuji logo, after the Great Mountain in Japan. Japan played an outsized role in the early stages of the video game market. Local coin-op companies were quick to import Pong and experiment with it, though they did not have many electronics specialists on staff. Seeing an opening and wanting to aggressively expand into new markets, Bushnell and new Atari president John Wakefield pushed to open a Japanese subsidiary in mid-1973. Atari Japan was only one front in a grand assault. Atari established itself in every major coin-op territory they could think of. Canada, the UK, the Pacific, France. Some were offices, others partnerships, but they all opened barely a year after the company had started. Bushnell had huge dreams for what Atari could be. But co-founder Ted Dabney was failing to keep in scope with this growth. Dabney had been pushed into overseeing manufacturing after completing and failing to sell Bally on the pinball game he created. He was increasingly in the dark about Bushnell's plans for Atari and felt like his partner was attempting to seize control. Sure enough, according to him, he was basically demanded to give up his stock in October 1973 so that Bushnell could bring more experienced management into the company. Bushnell recalls more that Dabney wished to get out as things came too big to manage, but either way, it was a straining split. Dabney took Atari's arcade operations before selling them back to the company and disassociating entirely from Atari in March 1974. Though the two co-founders maintained a personal relationship, the bond which had forged Computer Space was broken. The future of Atari now lay in the hands of others. This was far from the only corporate shakeup Atari endured at this time. In October 1973, a new competitor to Atari emerged, located not too far away from their office and staffed by close associates. To the industry, Bushnell claimed that this group had gone rogue, a splinter of Atari engineers who became one of the jackals he so despised. In reality, things were quite different. Key Games, named after Nolan's neighbor, Joe Keenan, was secretly owned by Atari. This was a tactic to subvert the norms of coin-op distributorship in the country. In any given territory, distributors carried exclusive brands of equipment, primarily jukeboxes. This meant that penetration in the market was dictated by how many distributors chose Atari as their exclusive video game company. By creating Key Games, who would make games to be distributed by Atari, and vice versa, they could potentially increase their domestic market share. The chief game designer at Key Games was Steve Bristow, who had known Nolan, Ted, and Alcorn at Ampex, where he worked as a summer intern. He helped Bushnell as a technician on the initial prototype for Computer Space, then got a job at Nutting Associates, where he and his wife created the two-player version of the game, after Atari's version was rejected. Bristow, highly accomplished in his own right, took to evolving the Pong formula in response to several factors. First was the emergence of the four-player Pong clones. Though Atari responded to this trend with Pong doubles, there was more to be mined out of this idea. Then there was an experiment Atari undertook, placing a Pong inside of a wine barrel so patrons could stand at the video game and look down into it, placing their drinks on top. With the surface area this orientation provided, Bristow could easily fit 4 players around a single unit, each with their own goal in a competitive game of elimination. Elimination, Key's first game, was Pong's first true evolution. 4 players at the edges of a box each defended their side with the limited range that a paddle provided. As in Pong, the aim was to get past the other players to zone out the ball. However, there were multiple potential targets now. The goals were closed depending on the number and position of the players, but there was no way to actually track who scored a point when the ball had multiple targets. What could be done to actually end a game? Bristow came up with an ingenious solution. Each player had counters, which would disappear when they missed a ball, not unlike in pinball. After 5 misses, the player was eliminated from the game, until 1 remained. It was a highly competitive twist on the ball and paddle formula, one with the potential to take in vastly more money than a standard 4-player unit. Unfortunately, Elimination was not super successful off the bat. This likely had to do with its form factor, an unusual boxy shape which lacked the ability to place drinks on top of it due to a bold top. Though it received a pseudo-sequel called Elimination Plus, which added a center obstacle, and Atari released the game as Quadrapong, it didn't do great by itself. However, it was copied by other companies, both in form and in function. Plus, for Key Games' first game, it didn't have to be all that successful to be profitable. They imported Atari's main manufacturing expert and established connections throughout the industry, making it a plausible competitor to Atari in this new field. All eyes remained on Atari as they prepared for their first true debut to the coin-op industry at the trade show in October 1973. 2 years earlier, Computer Space had taken no orders at this event. Now, variants of Pong from companies big and small littered the floor. In a wave not seen since the debut of pinball decades earlier, buyers were spoiled for choice over which ball and paddle game to jump in with. Yet, people knew that Atari were the originators. At their booth, they were showing off something different. Their game was called Gotcha, a step beyond abstract paddles and spaceships. Though still very much of the age, this time, players were embodying characters who chased each other across an ever-shifting maze. The idea began when Al Alcorn was helping to repair Pong boards. Component failures in the intricately designed circuit boards made the graphics of the games glitch, causing repeating patterns of the paddles in strange states. Feeling that he could turn this into a game mechanic, Alcorn worked to create a game that cycled between 2 patterns. These patterns constituted walls that 2 players would have to navigate as a slowly moving scan line worked down the screen to bisect it into a new state. A cross-shaped player chased a solitary dot, gaining points for the time they were able to avoid being caught. Then, they switched sides, being transported to new positions in the maze. It was something wholly different from what came before, and Atari took full advantage. While the game could be seen as a rather innocent game of tag, Atari recognized that their demographic of distributors and operators were of a certain... well, they were old men, and sex had never been something the coin-op industry shied away from. Atari decided to theme Gacha after a lover's pursuit, with a man chasing a woman in a coy game of hard to get. This idea was meant to be enhanced by the game's controllers. Industrial designer George Ferraco took the concept and created... yeah, the game was meant to have breast-shaped controls. These were ultimately not fun to use, and the system used the Space Race joysticks instead, but Gacha was a legitimately pioneering test case in players embodying characters in a game, even if the players never got to understand the full context. There was one other thing Gacha innovated in. At the trade show where Atari first showcased the game, they handed out door prizes to distributors, which included a variant of the game that was in color. Now, this was not the only game which was pushing video games into color. Nutting Associates had their own color Pong clone on the floor. But this appears to have been a test of the concept to gauge interest. Furthermore, it was also Atari's first collaboration with a very important partner. Steve Mayer and Larry Emmons were co-workers with the Atari co-founders in the Ampex Videophile division, the well from which much of their talent sprung. In early 1973, Mayer and Emmons started their own company called Cyan Engineering in Grass Valley, California, to take on research and development work in the expanding world of Silicon Valley. Atari was one of their first clients, with Bushnell asking them to work on a remote control version of Pong. That project never saw the light of day, but they did agree to help develop the color version of Gacha, which crudely defined each of the individual lines in the game's signal to a variant of red, green, or blue. While Color Gacha was never officially shipped as a product, likely due to the cost of color TVs, as TVs were still the way they displayed these games, this link between Cyan Engineering and Atari was vital for Atari's long-term survival. And we're still not done talking about Gacha. It appears that Atari flirted with the idea of making Gacha their very first single-player game, with a computer opponent. To accomplish this, they planned to partner with one of the most important chip makers in Silicon Valley, Intel. An ad advertising Intel's new computer chip, the microprocessor, we'll get there, stated that Gacha was scheduled to have a computer-controlled opponent at some point. Well, this may have just been wishful thinking, maybe a promise by Bushnell to a potential supplier he wanted to impress. The fact that it was even proposed shows how much faith Atari was putting into this game. Was it justified? Well, Gacha did better than Space Race. With a reported 3,000 units sold, it didn't match Pong, but nothing really could. Over 6,000 units of Pong sold by the end of 1973, and a total of more than 50,000 video games across all the existing manufacturers signaled to the world that video games were here. But were they here to stay? The coin-op industry had gone through many fads in its long history, with only a few games remaining mainstays. In fact, a fad for a different solid-state game, wall games, was completely destroyed by the video game market. Gacha did not inspire any imitations, but it did represent the potential breadth of video games in the mass market. Pong didn't have to be the only path forwards, and video games needed to evolve to survive in the long term. 1973 was the first true year of video games. From type-in listings to computer monitors to machines on location, the world truly started to see what had been kicking around in the most advanced engineering labs for years. The Odyssey was continuing to sell as well, with 89,000 units shipped after a year of uncertainty for the product's future. Magnavox agreed to up the production and feel out the home video game market further. This may be relevant. In 1974, we reach hyperspace. With proven markets, huge technological developments, and ecosystems supporting the creation of games, we'll see the rise of important innovators dropping in from all corners. Join us next time on Play History, where we tackle the greatest fantasies of them all, see how video games survived their first major crisis, and discover things you never imagined possible in the 1970s. I'll see you in 1974.